the students in our JCH community, and I'm joined by the lovely Professor Erika Feller AO. And yeah, we're going to be having a little conversation about International Women's Day. The theme this year is Balance the Scales. So, Professor Feller, could you introduce yourself and share your connection to Janet Clark Hall?
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Anna. I'm Erika Feller, and I have been a long time associate of Janet Clark Hall, going way back into the 60s, and I hesitate to say how far back, but I was at one point a non-resident here, and I enjoyed my time. It was my little haven at the university when I was studying law at Melbourne, and I used to come here regularly, so I have very fond memories of Janet Clark Hall. I'm currently a fellow of Janet Clark Hall. I'm a professorial fellow at the law school in the University of Melbourne, and prior to that I was 14 years an Australian diplomat with the Department of Foreign Affairs, and then 26 years with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
So what does this year's International Women's Day theme mean to you? So balancing the scales, and yeah, given your work in international law and humanitarian protection.
It is a very interesting theme. It's a strange way to have framed it, though. If I look back on my 40-year career as a woman trying to build my career in essentially a world, a male-dominated set of professions, I would have rather framed it as levelling the playing field because I came across lots of bumps in the playing field as I went through. Perhaps just a brief illustration, going back to the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I hope it's changed, but in the days I joined Foreign Affairs, there were very few women at all in it. And those women who were in the Department of Foreign Affairs were not really highlighted or given high-profile posts of the sort that went to the men. The men would be posted to Washington or London, to Tokyo or to Beijing, and the women would be posted to the softer posts. Very nice, like Copenhagen in Denmark, but not necessarily the ones that gave them the opportunity to show what they could do as diplomats. And why was that important? It was important because it was all on your curriculum vitae, your CV. So if you were in competition with men for promotions, for placements at different parts of the world, your CV would be very determinative of whether you got promoted or where you were placed. And so if you had not been equally balanced, so to speak, you hadn't had the same opportunities as men, you didn't have the opportunity to build up your CV, and therefore it kept going on like that. So I have to say, that to me was an example of how the playing field desperately needed to be levelled. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It was the sort of discrimination against women was very culturally embedded in those days. I have a feeling it still is. I could tell a lot of stories about difficulties associated with being taken seriously as a woman, with putting forward ideas which were then hijacked by men and became their ideas rather than the women, or just the sort of the double standards that prevailed at the time. I mean, when you were trying to show what you could do, there was a presumption in relation to men, by and large, that they were good at what they were doing. They were there because they were good at what they were doing. That was not the same presumption which prevailed in relation to women. They had to prove that they were good, and that was sometimes an uphill battle. But anyway, that's sort of levelling the playing field. If I go back to the theme, which as I said is an interesting one, it's a bit reminiscent of the law. Actually, if you think of Lady Justice and holding the scales and blindfolded. In fact, Lady Justice in Victoria is not blindfolded. I discovered that the other day. But the idea was that justice is meted out even-handedly, impartially, without any bias entering into because of race or religion or gender. And we know very well that in today's age, that's not how the justice system necessarily works in relation to women. If you look at women's issues such as rape, having to prove that can be a very difficult thing in court. Even getting women to come into the court system to make that complaint because they are scared of not being believed, which is by and large often what happens. But also domestic violence. Domestic violence is a plague today, but it's traditionally been relegated to the private realm. So it's been very difficult to get the justice system to accommodate in a fair and even-handed way the sorts of problems that women bring to it that are specific to being a woman. And I think certainly there is a need to balance the scales of justice from that point of view. I want to end on this part with a little quote from Margaret Atwood, who I'm sure you have read, and we all know The Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
She's very well known for having taken up the cause of women and having illustrated it very dramatically through things like her books. But at one point she said, and I think it's been quite often quoted, that men fear women laughing at them. Women fear men killing them. And I think that is a very vivid illustration of discrepancies and lack of balance.
So this year's theme focuses on actionable change. What practical steps can our institutions, communities, governments take to meaningfully balance the scales?
Well, as I just said, that's the hardest question, because one thing is to talk about the theory of it, and another one is to look at how you can change societies. We've talked a little bit, or I've talked a little bit about violence against women as being one of the big issues which has to be addressed. And I learnt the other day that there are some quite interesting practical initiatives. It's not enough to legislate. It's not enough to put in place good policies, because you have to address the root of discrimination, and that is often a long-standing cultural problem. And these initiatives I was talking about, I found very interesting. One of them is in relation to men who have a traditionally very dismissive view of women and wanting to put them in their place, and that translates to often in terms of violence. There are these behavioural programs, behavioural change programs, which are out there, and you might say, well, that's a good initiative. Men can go in, an initiative directed at men, they can go into this into these behavioural programs and hopefully change their attitudes, which will lead to a much more balanced approach to women. However, why don't they do them, apart from anything else? Because usually they're employed in one way or another. They can't get time off work to actually go and undertake these programs, and if they do, their pay is docked and it may be detrimental to their job. So these initiatives, which are being pursued at the level, I think, of the Victorian government level, are putting in place programs working with employers to make it easier for employers to facilitate the participation of men in these programs without it being detriment to the employment arrangements that the employers have with these men. Now, I think that's a very good initiative, and more of this sort of innovative thinking needs to be put in place. The other thing I want to say is that I believe that women have to be facilitated to be agents of their own destiny. It's hard to, maybe that's not a very good way of putting it, but when I was with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, we had a number of programs designed to ensure that women refugees were very much part of any decisions that were taken that affected their future, their families, their security, and solutions for it. So we had something called the 5 commitments to refugee women, and amongst those were that on every leadership committee in refugee camps, for example, there should be an equal number of women represented, so that the women's perspective was filtered down through the whole leadership of the camp into the community. And that had the spin-off effect of building up women's confidence, women's knowledge about leadership, and women's capacity to lead. And when they returned to their own countries, they became, in fact, agents of change in their own societies, because they brought back to often quite conservative societies a completely different perspective on what was the proper role of women. So we made quite sure that we were helping women become, as I said, agents not only of their own destiny, but agents of change in the countries, the more conservative countries, where they came from. And it was a very good initiative. But it's just one example of being practical about things, not only philosophical. And the final thing I want to say was at this talk the other day, which was a very interesting woman actually, and she was talking about the impact of small things that you can do, not just big things, but small things. And she said one of the problems that confront women advancing in their professions, or women taking their concerns to where they should be taken to have them dealt with, etc., is a fear of not being believed, a fear of retaliation, a fear of not being believed. And it can, according to this woman who was quite an expert in her area, it can make a huge difference to women if somebody just says to them, we believe you. And this sense of creating a belief basis for women is one way of enabling women to be courageous and step forward.
So from your experience working globally, where do you see the most urgent imbalances that need to be addressed?
That's a difficult question to answer, because the imbalances are different country by country, region by region. I mean, if I look at Australia, there are very much imbalances that belong to a kind of developed Western world. The pay imbalance. It's quite horrendous to think that still you can put forward a statistic that women in Australia, by and large, sort of receive 11% less pay than men. And it's not only because of the way the thing is, the economy is structured, it's because of practices also in employment situations whereby, for example, who gets bonuses and how much is the bonus and who gets rewarded for what. All of that tends to move against women by and large, or not against women, but in favour of men. I mean, there are these kind of issues. There are issues related to the extent to which women are represented in the scientific disciplines, the extent to which women are in STEM, etc. I think these are important issues which any society has to address. But if you look more globally, because you asked me about my global experience, I think violence against women is a huge issue, and access to justice is a huge issue. I'll give you one example. I travelled quite a bit to Sudan, and I went to Darfur a number of times, and I can remember very clearly interviewing a woman in Darfur who had been raped, a married woman, and because she had been raped, she was accused not as a victim of rape, but as a perpetrator of adultery. And so she was actually in prison in Sudan because rape put her in the category of an adulteress. So just showing you, that is a completely different sort of set of concerns that have to be addressed, more pressing and more immediate, unfortunately, than pay discrepancies or whatever. But another thing I want to mention here is that you can't take where we have gone for as if that is forever going to be like that. You can't take it for granted. And I say this because when you look around the world today, you see the rise of right-wing governments, extreme far-right-wing governments, and accompanying them is a whole philosophy which is permeating into the society. There is a woman, and I recommend you have a look at her, what she has written. She's quite an eminent journalist in the United States, an ardent Republican, and her name is Helen Andrews. And in her view, and she's propagating this view, and she's got a lot of followers, one of the worst things that has happened in our society over recent years is that women have achieved levels of equality in business, in the law, in education, and in medicine. And she argues strongly that women think differently to men, that women act on impulse and on empathy rather than on reason and good judgment, and that distorts the way the law is applied. It distorts the way industries are pursued, etc. I'm not going to go in further into her philosophy because, needless to say, I find it abhorrent
Yeah.
and objectionable. But what I also find extraordinary is the extent to which she's gaining followers. And if you talk to people who are in the women's movements today, they will tell you that they fear that there is a backlash growing against women and women's liberation, feminism, the feminist movement. Feminism is being equated with wokeness, for example. And that backlash is dangerous. And again, I said, every country is different. We can look at Afghanistan and we can look at what happened when the Taliban came back in and what happened to women's rights. They became negligible to non-existent. I heard a very interesting interview a couple of days ago about Syria, the northern part of Syria, which is the independent enclave of Kurdish Syrian Kurds. And they have a fascinating, actually, experiment there where they have tried to create a fully and totally equal society between men and women. This is in Syria, in the northeastern part of Syria. And to the point, for example, that every job in public administration is supposed to be held by a man and a woman at the same time, so that the woman's perspective is always there. But the danger, and this is what this interview, this podcast was about, was that it's now going to be wound back because the government has changed and it's become more of an Islamist government, and it may well be that this system, which is regarded worldwide actually as a very good example of what could be when it comes to women and actively playing a proper role in society, that it will start to be wound back. So the message is, and I think that's one of the big challenges, don't take things for granted.
So one last question for you, Professor Feller. What message would you give to our JCH students who are looking to make the world a more equitable and just place once they graduate?
Well, you are asking somebody who is a devotee of the United Nations. I believe in the United Nations, what it stands for. And what it stands for is equality and inclusion. And it has put its weight behind the commitment, which is articulated in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, that nobody be left behind. So what would I say to the JCH students? I would say that they should throw themselves wholeheartedly into support for the United Nations and engaging with its objectives and the work that it does. I want to say that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the United Nations is, and I found this when I've done lectures, quite a number of lectures here at London University, and I'm always asked, but does the United Nations have any role to play, and why hasn't it solved the situation in Gaza, or why can't it end the war in Ukraine? Well, I mean, the United Nations in that regard is no better than the governments who make it up. It can't do anything more than states can do themselves collectively. But the United Nations is the Security Council, yes. It's the General Assembly, yes. But it's also 40-odd, more so, special programs, special organisations. UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees, is one. You have World Food Programme, you have World Health Organisation, you have UNICEF for children, you have UNIFEM for women. And in all of these areas, it makes a huge unsung contribution. It's vaccinated millions of people. It's delivered food to all parts of the world. It has done many things, and importantly, because for me importantly, this is the area I've always worked in the rule of law, it has been the basis for promoting and encouraging and broadening the rule of law globally. Now, this is important in today's age because the rule of law is under serious attack. It is being dismantled as we talk, right, left and centre. You see states totally disregarding it, putting it aside, undermining it. And this is a terrible development for the future of the world. And so I would really strongly recommend people who have that bent and are interested, people who are interested in law, for example, to look seriously at a career in international law and understand very much what international law can do, how it can mean the difference between life and death for people in many parts of the world, and really throw themselves wholeheartedly behind that and the work of the United Nations, because we need young people with their idealism and their intelligence and their commitment and engagement to really step up in that regard more so than ever.
Great.